The following was recorded in front of a live studio audience at the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe. This is the United Podcast Network.
Welcome to the Quirky Dog Podcast, inspired by some of the quirkiest dogs you can ever imagine, and the owners who love them. This podcast is brought to you by the quirky couple themselves, Scott and Jess Williams. Their aim is to educate and entertain. Here's Scott and Jess.
Hello.
Welcome, guys, and happy Wednesday. Today, we are going to talk about giant breeds. We did a tiny dog podcast after we lost our 3-pound Pomeranian a few years ago now, and we have not done a giant breeds podcast. And I think we have to, because there's a lot of things to consider. And when we talk giant breeds, we're talking 100 pounds and over. We recently, this past weekend, just sent home a 160-pound Great Dane. They had a baby while we had the dog in for training. They coordinated that perfectly. But we've just been living with a giant breed for the past 3 weeks, so we want to talk to you about it while it was fresh. But first, we're going to start with the quirky tip of the day. Good job with the honking. That pig kind of blends right in.
I'm right there, babe.
Blends right into the shirt. So my quirky tip of the day is, if you're going to have a giant breed, you need to have a giant house. You guys, I'm telling you right now.
You need a giant car, if anything.
You need a giant everything. If you have a giant, you need a giant bank account. Make sure everything in your life is giant. The dogs are bigger, okay? And it's funny, I don't know if it's actually called this, but we call it the Great Dane Crate. Amazon sells it. And, you know, we said when they were coming in, they were dropping the dog off. They live a few hours away from us. They were dropping the dog off at our house, and we're doing follow-ups and everything in Elliott. And, you know, we said, oh, bring the crate when you drop off. And they said, oh, you know, it's 8 separate pieces and it's going to be hard to bring and everything else. And I said, oh, yeah, we have that same crate. We'll set it up. But literally...
We don't like to set it up either.
Well, yeah, but literally the Great Dane Crate, as I call it, maybe it's called that or not, it takes up a huge amount of space, you know, and we had a Newfoundland in the week before, and Scott's like, why can't we just put the Dane in this same crate? I'm like, because it's a Great Dane. And literally there was like an inch to spare on the top of that crate. But our house, like our whole meditation room, we've had all these super hot weeks. A lot of it is the Great Dane. I could fit about 6 Malinois in the space that the Great Dane fit. So make sure you have a big house, don't have a little apartment, and then get yourself a giant breed.
Well, certainly you can get by with a smaller living space, but for a vehicle, you got to have something sizable. You got to be able to get that dog in.
I mean, you need space. Like even the dog's bed, we ordered it a cot for training. Like we had to break it down for them to take it home. And I guess you have more experience with this than me because you own Ginger, who is a Mastiff.
Yeah, and she's not as big as a Great Dane. She was 150 pounds, a female.
But she was stockier.
She was thick, but not as tall. And yeah, I mean, she did take up a lot of space, but I did have a big house. And but the vehicle wasn't.
He did have a big bank account back in the day.
Yeah. Well, I remember the breeder telling me when I wanted to reserve the puppy, he's like, you need to have, you know, X amount per month for expenses for this breed. And, you know, he was almost, you know, he was doing the kind of the takeaway sale, if you will, but he was just trying to disqualify people from the wrong people buying these puppies.
Yeah.
And then saying, oh, it's too much money and this and that. When you have a large breed dog, everything is more expensive, including medical. The medical, just, you know, all the basics can be more.
Yeah,
everything
and
is more.
I did a quick, you know, Facebook thread because sometimes I like to gather public information and make sure we're covering our bases before we do a podcast. And really, all of the points I had already kind of hit on my own little checklist before. But a vet tech friend who's a good friend of ours, her comment for tips for giant breeds was pet insurance. And it's not a joke because everything is just so much more expensive. So if you're familiar with giant breeds and they're your scene, I hope that what we're saying resonates with you and we feel like we're educating the public well. If you're considering a giant breed, we're not trying to talk you out of it, but you need to be prepared, you guys. Something that is 100 pounds plus is a lot different to deal with than a 40-pound dog or a 20-pound dog or a 60-pound dog. And that may sound obvious, but unless you've actually held the leash, you may not understand that concept. And I've talked about my finger on the podcast. I mentioned it on last week's podcast. I have had the dog during this injury, and it's been a dog who's very new to me. So now I have a 160-pound dog, and For what it's worth, I don't even weigh 160 pounds myself. So I have a dog that outweighs me that I've been having to take out to go potty every single day with an injury that I absolutely cannot screw up. So it is so important to have good control of these dogs as early as possible. And this dog, luckily, had a beautiful temperament, and these people have done a great job of handling him at a very young age. He goes to a groomer. His nails looked perfect when he came in. I just gave him a bath. It was like the easiest bath we'd done ever when he went home.
It's kind of like having another person in the house.
But I'm just saying, like, it matters. Size matters, if you will. I'm not meaning to go there, but it really does in regards to these dogs. So if you're considering a dog like a Newfoundland, like a St. Bernard, like a Great Dane, like a Mastiff, any of these types of dogs, I wouldn't really qualify Dobermans as being giant breeds, but anything that's going to be 100 pounds or over, or potentially 100 pounds or over, do your homework. And just like Scott's breeder was trying to disqualify him when he got Ginger, we just had a client who got a Newfoundland puppy. It was a 2-year relationship before that owner and that breeder came together on a litter that would work for them and everything else. These giant breeders who are ethical are very, very, very careful of who owns these dogs, because these dogs could hurt someone, whether they're being malicious or not. They just jump on the wrong person, they knock an old lady over, and she has a concussion. So if you're jumping into this giant breed thing, be mindful of it, and we're going to give you some tips here today.
Well, the good news, or the nice thing about these giant breeds, usually from a temperament perspective, they're pretty human friendly. There's not a lot.
As long as they're socialized well. And honestly,
if they're bred well.
Yeah, but I mean, we were saying the Great Danes we've done in the past, they've been sketchy.
Fear, a lot of fear.
But not social. They've had a lot of issues where they've been a little bit concerned. And then now you have a dog who's 100 plus pounds that's demonstrating fear, like, oh my gosh, big to do. And, you know, I mentioned that this couple who we just sent their dog home this past weekend, she had a baby during the time we had this. Like, the dog isn't going to mean to do anything to the baby, but the dog cannot jump on the human bed if the baby's up there. The dog cannot just be roaming around during tummy
Climbing
time.
on the couch,
yeah,
like
these types of things really matter, because malicious or not, it's just the size. Okay, so they're going to be big. You need a big house, all of these other things. Another thing to consider is bloating. Bloating is way higher of a chance with a giant breed. And you know, there's been a lot going on in our lives this summer, and I very rarely try to turn away clients, but I just said to Scott, oh, like, you know, Great Danes can have a lot of health issues. And he goes, oh yeah, she got the stomach tied. So literally, gastroplexy, you guys. Gastroplexy, if you own a Great Dane, I am not huge on elective surgeries. I would 100% say talk to your veterinarian about it and see what they think, because the chance of bloat is very, very high in dogs like Great Danes, very deep chest barrel dogs, and a few of the other giant breeds. So that's something to consider, way more so than just a regular breed. And I'm not saying other dogs can't bloat. Clearly that can happen, but the chances go up like tenfold. That's not a statistic that is referenced by anything. That's just Jess.
Loosely define bloating, it's, I think, when the stomach twists,
stomach
gets
torsion.
Gas in there and it gets locked
stomach
in.
Torsion. And you're lucky if you can reverse it. We have a very good friend whose Doberman bloated a few years ago. She got to the emergency vet within like 10 minutes. They were able to operate and reverse it. It was still a $10,000 surgery, but oftentimes dogs do not survive bloat. So gastroplexy is on my list, huge thing.
And you need to know what you're looking for with the symptoms of that, because it's real subtle in the beginning. It's like, oh, the dog doesn't look like they're feeling good. But people that know about that can spot that early on and say, okay, boom. Especially if you have a dog prone to it. You're like, okay.
Typically after they eat, there can be some retching. Maybe we'll do a whole bloating podcast, but just consider at least talking about the gastroplexy if you own a giant breed, especially a Great Dane. Raised food bowl. This is another thing to consider. Orthopedically, just logistically, everything else. You have a dog now. I mean, this dog literally was over my hip when he sat next to me. He's going to be bending his head down all the time to the floor to eat. No, have a raised food bowl.
It's like a giraffe.
Yeah. You really don't know until you're like doing it every day of your life for 3 weeks. And you're like, oh my gosh, Cousteau, our 80-pound Malinois, he looks like a little baby now compared to this thing. But these raised food bowls, these owners did their homework. The wife had owned Great Danes before in the past. This is her breed of choice. Raised food bowl, easier access, better for them orthopedically. You're not going to get weird digestive issues that happen. All right, let's go to break super quick. When we get back, I'm going to go on and on and on and on and on about tips for giant breeds.
Want to keep up with all the latest from the Quirky Dog podcast like me and Murphy here? then make sure you head on over to the YouTube channel and subscribe. Or if you prefer to listen to the madness, go on over to iTunes or Spotify and follow the Quirky Dog Podcast. And hey, while you're there, leave a rating and review and let them know what you think of the show. Till then, keep it quirky.
I was just thinking during break when I said, I'm going to go on, that's probably going to make people go to the next episode. So if you listen a lot, everybody's probably
off.
It's enough. Jess. You're married to me. Now stop it. Okay. Another thing to consider is pano. That is when everything is growing too quickly for the dog. Okay. And typically pano, it's very rarely life-threatening. I don't know if it even can be life-threatening, it's joint pain as the dog is growing. This is something to consider. Proper nutrition, maybe a diet that isn't too high in protein. All of these things, you're going to have a higher chance of pano with the giant breed and specific giant breeds than you may with a normal-sized dog. It's not that other dogs can't get pano or other breeds can't get pano, but this is a term that you hear thrown around a lot more often when we're talking about giant breeds. And
I see it a lot with German Shepherds.
Yeah, but they also can be big too. I mean, some German Shepherds now can be pushing 90 plus, but it's that bone growth happening too quickly for the dog. Very important. While we're on joint supplements. So typically the hard rule for most joint supplements is you don't start dogs until 18 months. When you're coming with the giant breeds, you're going to think a little bit earlier, but a little before a year, maybe add a year. Definitely talk to your vet about that and everything else. But that hard rule of 18 months is different. And that brings me to their life expectancy is not the same, you guys. I mean, these Malinois, they're supposed to live 10 to 12 years. These Border Collies, they can live 12 to 15 years. Some of these giant breeds, honestly, it can be 6 to 8 years. It's really, really tough. It seems like as soon as you get a handle on things and as soon as the dog is doing great, now all of a sudden you've lost the dog. So be prepared for that. It's a shorter lifespan. Everything is going to be happening at a quicker rate, including ideally getting control on the dog. But be prepared for the heartache of that. And, if the giant breed is your jam and you love these dogs and you can stomach it and heart it and everything else, I totally get it. But even a healthy giant breed, sometimes 6 to 8 is their life expectancy, which is just a whole other way of looking at things.
People are definitely, we all have our breed, and Great Danes, they're like this woman had a previous Great Dane. I've had several clients who have had Great Danes, that's just their dog,
Or Newfoundlands, any giant breed. It just, that can be your jam, but the life expectancy is different.
I was going to say also, I don't know if you mentioned it or not, but the spay and neutering.
No, let's talk.
You want to hold off on that until the dog is physically and emotionally mature. I say that with every dog, but with a giant breed, that could be 3 years old. It takes time for these dogs to fill out.
I would even recommend getting x-rays of the joints to make sure all the growth plates have closed. But yes, that's a very good point. Early spay and neuter. It's important for them to have their hormones as long as possible, especially with a sort of a lifespan.
You wind up looking real lanky and weird, if they get
that
neutered
goes
too
for
early.
any breed, but still.
Yeah, no, any breed. You're right. But
there.
They just don't develop the same way as they're supposed to if they get the hormones cut off before they get a chance to develop.
Yeah, and then, we've done probably more Danes, I would say, as giant breeds than anything else.
Newfies, a lot of Newfies.
Newfies, yes. St. Bernards. Sometimes the Newfies don't always even get to 100. Sometimes they've been a little under 100. The St. Bernard scene, I don't think you and I have ever trained a St. Bernard together. I just want you guys to consider, I think it was the movie Beethoven or whatever, when you're talking about a giant breed and then you're talking about saliva like that, it is a whole to-do, And this Dane that we had in, it wasn't super drooly and he was pretty clean considering.
When this dog drank water,
Oh, it was everywhere.
He came away from the water bowl. It was just
yeah, it looked like
everywhere.
Yeah, it looked like there was a pool. But literally, you guys, we have had clients before that literally carry a rag on them. So again, I'm not trying to talk you out of anything, but the slobber and the drool when we're talking about a big dog, it's a whole other echelon than just a few drops or oh, that's too much. It is
you have accessories that come along with the dog.
Yes, it's a whole thing to consider. So be conscious of these things. Mattresses. The reason I brought up that we've trained Great Danes before, who was it? The lady that had the 2 dogs as
I had a
Great Dane client
in California with 2 Great Danes, and they bought a cargo van and put big twin mattresses in the back of the van for these dogs, and then they had. And in California, there's a lot of indoor-outdoor living space type stuff, so it wasn't quite as big a deal to have a giant house because the living space extends out into the into the back deck and all that. But they had these mattresses just laying around for the
Yeah.
for the dogs so that they didn't get their elbows all calloused up and everything.
But it's something to consider because literally, like the dog bed that we got for this dog for the place command going home, it's very bulky, it's very big. Like, you know, twin mattresses, maybe baby mattresses if they're extended for the dogs just to be able to lay on and be in the house. It's something to consider. The couch.
Well, this dog had his own couch.
Yeah, well, we haven't seen their house, but yeah, they said he has his own couch. I mean, and that's another thing. If you guys are planning on, oh yeah, we want to have the dog with us on the couch, and you have just like a normal seated sofa, you might want to get the dog its own couch, or you might want to expand so you have one of those couches that like goes across the whole like span of the room. I mean, these things are important, and you don't think about it until you're there and the dog's a year old and you're like, wow, this dog really is big. This is a whole other thing to consider. The dog can reach places that other dogs can't. It's just,
they can counter surf without taking their legs off the ground.
Yeah, they're not even jumping on the counter. The nose is just counter height. We have a yard. How big is our chicken fence for our dog yard? Yeah. We have a 5-foot fence for our dog yard. We don't think twice of it, right? Like, and I take all the dogs out that we have in for training on leash.
We don't have any escape artists to begin with.
But regardless, we have this fence, and there's, you know, these panels that we order from Amazon. We're doing recalls in the backyard, and it was not because he was trying to be naughty.
He heard something outside.
He just like went to put his feet on this fence, and I'm like, oh, that's never happened before. Like, he's gonna knock this over. It just gives a different perspective, and
he was head and shoulders over the fence. Yeah, it wasn't like he was peeking.
Yeah.
Like,
we took him swimming.
Up?
Oh my God, we take every dog swimming. If anyone from With Meow listens, they see us with so many dogs over the years. It's not even funny. So we took the dog swimming, and the pool, I know this from seeing Cousteau, our dog, almost drown one time without having a life jacket on him. I would have jumped in. But the pool is only 4 to 5 feet, right?
I would have told you to jump in.
So with the finger, I got to keep it dry. So the pool's only 4 to 5 feet. We're swimming this Great Dane. First time this has ever happened to us, I'd say probably 50 plus pet dogs there in the last couple of years.
Back legs are on the
back legs are walking, and his front feet are just going. And then Scott's like, help pull him up. And I got my finger. We did like 3 rounds. I'm like, we can't do this. If we were in a lake or an ocean or something and he couldn't touch the bottom, it would have been a whole other thing. But literally, it was just becoming like this rear end workout where he's walking on his back legs. He has a life jacket on, and his front feet were going. Complete disaster. I was soaked.
Kind of like the Special Olympics.
I was soaked. I was absolutely soaked. You better really check yourself. Okay, so mattresses.
One thing I want to say about giant breeds, from a training perspective, if you have a giant breed that has some reactivity, gentle leader is a great tool.
Yes.
Because they are big and powerful, and when they go, they go. And a gentle leader on the front of that nose can really help a smaller person with a much larger dog.
And that brings me to, you know, this dog came in because they wanted a little better control over him and everything else. My little Facebook thread and my little sample size of my friends and everything else list, literally at least 6 people were like, manners, 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 manners. It does matter that your giant breed is more well-behaved than another dog. I'm sorry, it just does. For everyone's safety, for your own safety and everything else. So ideally, you're heading those reactivity issues off on the front end, but it really, really does matter. Speaking of handling and making sure that the dog is okay with all of this stuff, another one of my tech friends commented, like, you know, yeah, when we're in the office and the dog has no control, it's like wrestling a baby cow. It totally is. So make sure they're very comfortable with teeth and ears and feet and everything very early on. Also make sure they're just okay to lay on their side. You can get them to lay down and you can get them to lay on their side so you can examine something underneath them, all this other stuff. Very important tidbits to consider.
And they're pretty easy to train to do that stuff because they're so heavy that they're more comfortable laying down anyway.
Yeah.
You just don't want to be having these power struggles with a 150-pound dog.
And that's the other thing, too. Endurance, you guys. They're just not going to have the same endurance that a smaller breed has. Granted, it's been very hot this summer, but you have to be more mindful of how far are you walking. Even if their joints are all developed and everything's great, how far away from the house are you? What if something goes wrong? How the heck are you going to get the dog back? Are you going to have some sort of wagon? Are you going to have something else? Endurance is not necessarily going to be the same as a dog that's even 80 or 90 pounds. When we're talking 100 plus, it's a whole different ballgame. I mean, if you consider the vet scales that are at the vets, half the time they barely even are a size that's big enough to accommodate these dogs. You know, some of the upper scale vets have like the scales that the dog can just walk on, that is like part of the seriously though, we're talking more mini horse. Well, that's a little high with weight, but it's a different ball game. So just be very, very conscious of all of these little things, especially if you're trying to dip your toes in the sand with giant breeds and you haven't previously been familiar with them.
And my dog, my Mastiff, and this Great Dane both had really nice natural retrieving ability in them. So we were throwing a stuffed animal for this Great Dane, and he'd go get it and bring it back. But you got to be careful about how many times you do it. It was hot. You know, it's been hot this whole summer. So, I mean, if we get, 4 or 5 of these things completed, it's like, okay, let's wrap this up.
Yeah, and that'll be one of my last points here, and that is toys. The size of your toys matters. Your dog should have an impeccable drop it and leave it command, especially when we're talking giant breeds. But again, we're going to size matters here. They shouldn't have a normal size tennis ball. They shouldn't have toys that all of a sudden just can disappear. You need to get bigger toys. They need to be supervised. I've literally seen stories before online where, there's a Great Dane that ate 18 socks and no one notices until all of a sudden the dog is so backed up and they go in for x-ray and it's like nothing they ever saw before. So make sure that you're very mindful that whatever the dog has access to, it cannot easily swallow. And even if it can easily swallow and it's not going to get stuck on the way down, you still could be looking at an obstruction on the other end. So a huge, huge consideration when you're buying toys, when you're buying things for the dog to interact with, what is going to happen and how to keep the dog safe in the long run. Yeah,
because even a lab can choke on a tennis ball. I mean, for a Great Dane to accidentally inhale a tennis ball is it's not a far stretch at all.
No, not at all.
It's kind of like a golf ball to a normal dog.
Yeah, no, and those probably won't pass for a normal dog either. So I hope that we helped you. I hope that we served giant breeds in such a way that makes people feel more educated and we gave them the best bang for their buck. We love giant breeds. They're awesome, but honestly, after just living with one for 3 weeks, when our largest dog is normally 80 pounds, we learned a lot. Next week, we are having Dave Shillelagh on. He is from Mass Vested Dog. He is bringing his awesome Malinois Kona. Dave contacted me after the Paul Bourgeois podcast, and this is to serve dogs that are currently in the field, not just retired police dogs. So make sure you check that out. And in the meantime, keep it quirky. Bye, guys. Thanks for joining us here today.
The views and opinions expressed by the hosts, guests, or callers of this program do not necessarily reflect the opinions of the Studio 21 Podcast Cafe, the United Podcast Network, its partners, or affiliates.